This is, in a sense, a continuation of last week's discussion on normal neurological development. Yet if this is the first that you're attending in our series, you're still in the right place. We'll start off with a brief review of the developmental sequence chart, and then get into our main topic of trauma and anxiety. Our third webinar that's taking place next week continues the discussion looking at the educational component and how academics and behaviors can be affected. In conjunction with these lectures, we are offering 5 complimentary screenings, opportunities to discuss your concerns online with Bette Lamont and determine if this approach would be a good fit for you. If you are listening to the end of our program, you can put in the chat box that you would like to be entered into our drawing for the free screening by just writing free screening, and we'll gather your name and get that information out to you. Or you can also contact Bette at developmentalmovement@gmail.com to enter the drawing within a week if you're listening to this on replay. My name is Jessie Forston, and I'm a neurodevelopmental movement consultant, along with a licensed educator and a mom to 2 boys. I trained with Bette and was certified in 2014, and currently work with clients around Minnesota and the Midwest. We hope that you walk away from our discussion today knowing what trauma can do to the brain and how the traumatized brain creates more and more anxiety. Now, I'm pleased to introduce my friend and colleague, a practitioner for 33 years, an educator and writer working nationally and internationally with families and professionals. She's the wisest woman I know working in the field of neurodevelopmental movement, Miss Bette Lamont.
Thank you, Jessie. That's incredibly sweet. Thank you so much. And I'm so excited that you are here, that everybody is here. I hope I have people from last time as well. And for those of you who were here last time, this will go deeper into the work that we looked at last time. There may be a couple of repeats, but mostly what we want to do is take some of that same material and go deeper. And as Jessie said, if you weren't here last time, that's fine, because what we're going to do is refer back to a chart that we went over last time, the chart of normal neurological development. And what we want to take a look at with this chart is how the progression of development is programmed into every infant, how that sequence unfolds. And it's represented in the chart that we have on how we take things in. How do we take in information? How does the brain take in visual, auditory, and tactile stimuli? And how do we put out information? How do we move around and communicate and use our hands?
And one thing that I forgot to say, if you did not get a copy of the chart emailed to you, just put it in the chat box and I'll be sure to get one sent to you. They were sent out last week with an article. So just put in the chat box if you need one, and we'll be working on that.
We're going to pop that chart up on the screen so you can take a look at it. So if you're looking at your own chart or the one Jessie's about to pop up on the screen there, what we're looking at is layers of the brain. Each layer of the brain is dependent on the integration and the maturity of the layer beneath it for full competence and well-being and health. So, and for those of you that don't have it until you get it in the mail, we've got one right here in front of you. The maturation of the brain is achieved not by the infant being passive, but by the infant going through a progression, a ladder of developmental activities, reflexes, movement, and sensation. And when we look at this whole thing, what we're looking at is called the developmental sequence. Last week, we went through a lot of particular functions, but in quite general terms, the way that what does normal neurological development look like? Our topic today is trauma. So we're going to look at how trauma impacts the brain at some of these very, very low levels of the central nervous system. Things that you can't take to therapy because you can't access them, to talk therapy. Things that you may not understand. The children who say, the adopted children I've worked with who say, I really want to love my parents, but I don't know how. The adults who say, I don't want to rage, but I don't know how to stop once it starts. So we're going to look at how trauma impacts the brain. But we also want to look at how does a traumatized brain then perpetuate more trauma? And for instance, the question, why do women who have been abused by a partner continue to stay, was a question I was looking at really early on. And that's that cycle of the traumatized brain continues to experience trauma and presents more trauma in their lives. And again, all of these are changes in the brain below the level of our consciousness. This is where we're going to focus today. This is just an overview. We're going to cover the same levels that we covered last week, and these are mostly the most often overlooked functions of the central nervous system. Now, when we're talking about trauma, I realize it is a big topic in our culture right now, and there are many effective approaches to trauma. And I'm not suggesting that this is the only solution. But I do think it is a piece that is the most often overlooked. And when this piece is overlooked, we find that children and adults both can have a sense of guilt and shame about not being able to overcome some of their fears and anxieties, some of their paranoias, and some of their withdrawal. So we're going to go back to that chart, and I want to take a look again, as we did last week, at that level that we're calling the pons level brain, which is that 1 to 5 months level of development, when 2 levels of the brain are coming in at this time, both the pons and the amygdala. One of the things we looked at last week was eye tracking. Now, if we have an immaturity or any disruption in the development of a very natural skill that comes in at this time, eye tracking, we interrupt the baby's ability to keep track of where their caretaker is in the environment. So the baby that can't look around the room and find the caretaker, which is a soothing act on their part, may develop a little bit of anxiety. If there's no caregiver for them to look at, the anxiety will heighten even more. Ultimately, we're going to use that for reading, but what I want to also look at is eye gazing. That when the baby at this stage begins gazing into their parents' or their caregiver's eyes, they look at the pupillary signals from the caregivers, particularly the mother's pupil, will reciprocate in the baby's eyes. This is the time when we can begin to produce oxytocin, that bonding chemical that is the love and cuddle hormone. And interestingly, I was working with another neurodevelopmental practitioner who's also a vision therapist, who pointed out to me that some research indicates that 80% of our vision makes pictures on our brain, but 20% of the nerves from our eyes go down into a place in the brain called the limbic system, picking up on our emotional responses and sending emotions back out through the pupils. It's the beginning of the mirror neuron time, when we learn what other people are sending us emotionally through their pupillary responses. So the eye gazing is very important. And when I work with children who have not been able to gaze into an adult's eyes, particularly because they are, for instance, in an orphanage, adopted children may have no chance to gaze into a human face. Children whose mothers may not make eye contact with them because they're depressed. They are sleeping all the time. When they make eye contact may not be loving. The baby themselves may be born with an illness that keeps them from comfortably being able to focus in on the parent's face. And one of the saddest things I run into is parents who are on their cell phone so much that they are not looking into the baby's eyes to get this great bonding and connectivity. So this eye contact that produces oxytocin signals that they are safe. And if they cannot make the eye contact, there's a signal to them that there may be some danger. And some babies will produce cortisol in response to that sense of danger. I'm working on a theory that this is a stage in the brain where we reach a hormonal set point and the brain almost makes a decision. The oxytocin that floods our brain with love and cuddling and the ability to learn and to be close to one another gives the brain a rich background for developing memory, learning, good relationships. However, if the baby, and beginning with eye contact, they do not have that contact with another human being, they can tip towards a more cortisol-based brain, which cortisol being a neurotoxin and signals trauma and danger will actually damage the central nervous system itself. Cortisol is a neurotoxin, and if we flood the brain with too much cortisol, we can actually cause damage, which is another way the brain is traumatized. Just through our own emotional responses, we can be traumatized with too much cortisol in the central nervous system.
Betty, I just want to point out you are covering up the camera just a little bit.
A
There
little
you
bit, a little bit. Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, I
go.
have
Okay, we
notes.
want to see your smile.
All right, thank you. So when I work with children that have had trauma at this level, one of the things I see, and it starts with eye contact, is a sense of just sort of fending for themselves. They may not seek eye contact. They may learn to self-soothe. They may need to turn inward. So right here, you begin to see something where trauma, perhaps the lack of a caregiver, a difficult birth, a depressed mother, a mother who's on drugs and alcohol, that trauma affects the baby's brain, but then the trauma that has been impacting the brain then creates more trauma in the child where they sense more danger and they withdraw more and more. The resolution, when this particular neurodevelopmental soft sign is resolved in the context of the bigger growth of the child, what we see is comfortable eye contact, a willingness to be nurtured. They're able to be happy with family and other safe people in their lives. They can find contentment. So this is where we start. When we move over another box and it says vital response to threatening sounds, this is a child that will respond to danger that they perceive in their environment. So they'll have a big startle response to things that they perceive as dangerous. So a smoke alarm going off, like you are with, a dog barking near them, a horn honking. All of those may be alarms that cause them to startle. When this is disrupted by injury or by lack of responsiveness from the community around them, they can end up either in a constant startle to the world that all sensations can become too much, or they may not startle at all. Now, this is one of the early signs of autism I've seen in children, where children who can otherwise hear are completely non-responsive to things that they might perceive to be a danger. And I've worked with several children who that was one of the first signs that they recognized that the baby was not responding to vital, threatening sounds in their environment. So this is another source of cortisol in their system. And again, cortisol, being a neurotoxin, will damage the brain and then compound the original trauma. Now, I'm going to do a little pause here for those of you that weren't here last time, because the population of children I work with are largely traumatized. Children who come from orphanages, children who have been adopted in this country, abused and neglected, children who've had other kinds of trauma in the birth process where perfectly good and consistent and parenting and no abandonment of the child, but the child themselves cannot be responsive to create relationship. I want to do a little nod to sensory processing disorder, and I may have spoken of some of this last time, but I want to make a statement about sensory processing disorder and how entrainment with the parents and caregivers is so much a source of comfort and allows the baby to develop fully. If you take a little baby for a walk, you're walking with the baby and the baby's over your shoulder, close to you. where they can feel your heartbeat, they can feel your breath, they can feel your the dynamic of your body. That entrainment with your body gives them information about your responses to what's around you. So you're going for a walk with a little one, 6 months old, and a fire engine comes by, and the fire engine has its sirens on, and it's loud and it's big and it's fast, and there's wind and there's noise and there's red and it's big, and it's truly overwhelming. But the little baby attached to a loving, trusted caregiver will not experience their mother's or father's heart rate going up. They won't feel any anxious breathing because it's just a fire engine, right? However, if you put this baby down in a stroller, one of those jogging strollers, and just a little side note here, I don't know why moms who are just 2 months after giving birth have to get back to their athletic figures, because the babies need us more than we need to get back in shape, but that may be just my own consideration. But that baby out in that jogger is facing the wind and has no idea that there's a parent behind them. And as you are jogging along and that same fire engine comes by, the baby has no way to process the sound, the light, the wind, the general hubbub of that situation, and is left to their own devices and getting excited and getting overwhelmed by sound, by light, and has no idea that this is safe because the whole scenario presents them with danger, danger, danger. So my theory that I'm developing is that much of the sensory integration disorder that we're seeing may in fact be coming from the baby not in training enough, being not enough attached to the mother's body to pick up the signals that the mother or parent is sending out so that they can calm themselves. There was a very interesting research project that was done in the 1950s in relation to self-regulation among children. And I find it really fascinating, and I think as we get more and more detached from children and let them suffer through more and more traumas on their own, this becomes more and more evident. But they took a group of children in the 1950s and they tested them for self-regulation. And the way they tested it is that they just asked them to stand completely still for a certain period of time. And they tested 3-year-olds and 5-year-olds and 7-year-olds. And many, many results, many, many children in the hundreds. In the year 2000, they replicated that same test. And the 3-year-olds in the year 2000 couldn't begin to do the level of regulation that the 3-year-olds could in 1950. The 5-year-olds in the year 2000 were kind of more like the 3-year-olds were in the year 1950. And the 7-year-olds were barely keeping up with the 1955-year-olds. So in disrupting our connection to our children, we are in fact taking away some of their ability to self-regulate, to process their sensory environment, and to be calm within themselves, to just simply stand still. So our child, when we were talking about these auditory responses and how we can train with adults to calm all of these responses, not just auditory, but other sensory issues. As they're resolved, this child can become a flexible child. They can be calm in a wide range of environments. They can filter out what they need. They can attend to what's important. They can be present. So we're going to come back to that as we go up to the next level of the central nervous system. I'll try to not let my pages get in the way of your picture. At this stage, we're talking again about 2 to 7 month old babies. Their system becomes very attuned to vital sensation. Vital sensation means the stuff that could kill you. Heat, cold, pain, and hunger. This is a brain that thinks in life and death, black and white. When this gets disrupted, when we have an injury to the central nervous system, which may be acquired through a difficult birth, through a fall, this brain, it may not feel pain appropriately. And so and I have seen this in adults as well. I was posing the question at the beginning, why does an abused woman potentially stay with that abuser? But someone who has been beaten, or someone who's had a difficult birth, it could be, very different circumstances causing this, may have a higher than normal pain threshold. When your pain threshold is not immediate and appropriate, you become someone potentially who takes risks, unaware of sort of where safety may lie. I worked unaware of pain specifically. I think I had mentioned last time that I had worked with a boy who was playing soccer. He was a child with a high pain threshold. Playing soccer, he tumbled, he fell, he stood up, and parents said, "Come on over here, let's check you out, let's see what's happening with that leg." And he said, no, I want to finish the game. And they finished the game, walking very strangely. And the parents said, we got to check this out. They took him to the doctor. He'd broken his leg in 2 places and continued to play the game because he didn't have an appropriate pain threshold. At the same time, what you might see in those who've been hurt in this way is that you may see a great deal of fear, because they do not know where that line is, the line that says safety. So they may be overly risk-taking and at the same time overly anxious. So that same young man who played a soccer game on a broken leg was also afraid to enter a dark room and could not go into his bedroom if the light was off. Unfortunately, the trauma that was delivered to the brain that caused the high pain threshold, and again, that trauma could be as early as birth and as late as, being beaten up in a back alley. But that trauma can lead to an unawareness of the needs of others. So that child, for instance, may not understand that other people experience pain and can easily be the one who inflicts pain on others and perpetuates trauma on others because of their own trauma. The feeling state of those kids is often feeling unloved, unwanted, anxious, angry. Because they don't get any accurate feedback from their environment. And as we're working with these children and we start to stimulate the part of the brain that has the potential to create an appropriate pain threshold, we also would integrate a sensory program that would help bring that pain threshold down. But these become the bullies, and the children that I have worked with, and this would be, I said heat, cold, pain, and hunger. And all of those are really important to observe in children. So the child who has been injured may be also unable to understand when they're hungry and may be anorexic. So the children and adults that I work with who've suffered this kind of trauma then perpetuate the trauma by becoming bullies, by traumatizing themselves, becoming cutters, becoming anorexics, becoming risk takers, expecting others to be risk takers with them. Sometimes they look as if they have no compassion, because if I don't understand how I feel, I can't understand how you feel. If I have no ability to understand my own emotions. They also children who seem to have no remorse. So there is a saying, many sort of motivational, I've heard this from a couple of motivational people, but it's that hurt people hurt people. Get it? Hurt people hurt people. Traumatized people traumatize people. So there's where we get the cycle of violence. But also I have found that among those adults I have worked with who are able to speak of their experience, and adults are wonderful to work with in this way, that they can speak of their experience and their changes and are observant in a way that children are not. When I've worked with adults who have a high pain threshold, they also come to realize that they've blunted or they have been blunted from feeling their other deep, big feelings, joy and love and other huge ecstasy, other huge, huge, deep emotions. So when we work with those children and adults, what resolution looks like is it looks like I belong. I belong. I have a place in the universe. And I know others belong and they have a place in the universe, which is something I think we need in our politics right now a whole lot. The sense that there are others with their own lives who have their own big feelings and who need to be made part of our world as well. So the activity children do, movement is the key here. And I know I have a couple of movement people here. And this is always very exciting for movement people, because movement is the way that we access the brain. And even before we can think about movement or be aware of movement or notice reflexes, before we have an awareness that we are a human being, movement is the educator of the brain. So at this stage of development, crawling, when babies are on their tummies and they're moving forward, provides a kind of safety. And if you're looking at the chart there, you look at that level that says ponds, and just over to the right of that, it says tummy crawling in the prone position. The prone position provides so much safety. And in the same way, because your tummy, your vital organs, all this soft stuff is on the floor, and it's good to have it on the floor or against mommy. I see children who are picked up and exposed to the world this way. You just see that slight moment of disorientation and anxiety. That's kind of the same disorientation and anxiety when you see the child who's not entrained with their parent in that fire engine situation, a sense of kind of being lost, because babies, the tummy is just so vital for that sense of safety. But crawling gives us something that's very extraordinary and particular to the human race. We stand on our lower body. Our lower body is our support. Our lower body defends us. It is our strength. It is our getaway. It stands up for us. It grounds us. Receptors on the bottoms of the feet tell us that we are grounded, and that there's a scientific name for that called graviception, and it gives us a sense of security. What that does is free this upper body to carve and sculpt the world, to reach out, to create relationship, to pull relationship towards us or push it away, to create, to pick up tools and use fine tools. And every little finger, as you get towards the extremities of the upper body, have receptors on different parts of the cortex. So once we get this little baby, this little child who feels confident in their lower body, we free the upper body to do the unique things that human beings do. It's a marvelous, amazing system. When you look at the whole animal kingdom, where else do you get that? Really, that great distinction and integration of those two functions. So the deeply grounded child, the child that has a sense of their lower body, becomes confident in themselves. I stand up for myself. I can take care of myself. When I work with children who have no chance to crawl, often there is a lot of confusion about where their strength comes from and how they protect themselves. And we're talking about trauma and anxiety. So the child that never had an opportunity to crawl on their tummy never got to feel the thrust of their little foot that pushes them forward across the floor. They never got to feel the force vectors pushing that hip bone into the hip socket and stabilizing their hips and giving them a sense of I am. So when we get children that crawl, it's just fascinating. There is no work I'd rather do than this. I mean, it's so fascinating because often we start to access those very early anxieties. We get to touch on that tipping point between, is my brain basically oxytocin based, or do I have a cortisol stress anxiety brain? As we get them crawling, they start accessing that. As we get them crawling, they start feeling the strength of that lower body. As they get to crawling and really distinguishing what parts of their body are for what, as they get their graviception, the resolution of a poor crawl is not only the resolution of all these other issues, but these are kids who can stand up for themselves, literally stand on their own 2 feet, take a stance, right? So out of fear and cowardice and anxiety and despair comes a groundedness. I didn't take a note about this. Something just came to mind. I worked with a woman who had been sexually abused by her stepfather early in her life. And when we started doing this, and she started crawling at the age of 42, I think, she said she felt like she was rebuilding her totem, and her image was as a totem pole. And she was working at building each section on the way up. It was so exciting. And it was a totem pole of power. It had a big sea eagle at the top. So that's what's happening that gives us strength and power. It helps us either overcome trauma or feel more traumatized, is that crawling. By the way, if you ever work with, the body work people among you, if you ever work with somebody who moves from their lower body, that's, you hold so much anxiety up there. If you're moving from your lower body, you're probably conquering some of that trauma and anxiety. As we move along over to the language section, for the babies, there is a call response cycle. And we did start talking about that last time. The baby needs to know that if they are experiencing any of those vital sensations, heat, cold, pain, hunger, that are going to kill them, because that's the way their brain thinks, you are going to be there to save their life. That call response cycle gives them a sense of power. When I see traumatized babies who've not had that developed, either because of their own brain injury, the dysfunction in the family, being left in an orphanage, abandoned, abused, neglected, when they have gone through that, we see children that actually stop crying. They start, again, fending for themselves. They put the thumb in the mouth to stop and the crying becomes pointless, and they self-soothe by sucking their thumb and sucking their toes, and become very, very silent. For those of you who have not worked with adoption, you know that you're in an orphanage that's going to have a lot of challenging children when you walk in, and it's completely silent, and it's full of 90 babies. So silence in a child at this age is not a good sign. So when I see the kids that have disrupted and traumatized issues at this level, it looks like the good baby who never cries. He's such a good baby. He never cried. He's tough, never cried. This is the silent child who also doesn't trust anyone. They're often, as older children, unable to speak up on their own behalf. They're unable to take care of themselves by saying no. This is where the abused woman, that was what popped into my mind when I was thinking about this lecture, where the abused woman image comes up, is that you lose the ability, after you abused enough, the ability to speak up for yourself, to stand your ground and say no, disappears. So resolving this looks like a child is able to speak up for themselves, able to make their case, able to say no, and can't be manipulated by other children or adults. So those are our kiddos and their trauma at that level. Now the manual function at this level is I call it a trauma fist. And we talked about it last time. Way over there, it says vital release. The baby's born with the thumb tucked in the fist. And that can be a source of comfort, actually, for us as adults. Anybody that's going to get a root canal and is going to have that great big needle going in there may easily have their thumbs tucked in their fist while that thing goes in. It's kind of what we do. It's also the result of a brain injury. When you see the fist like this that can't be opened up except by pulling the fingers open, that's a brain trauma to that Pons level brain. But it is also a sign of anxiety, trauma and anxiety in the brain of a child who could at will open their palms at any time. We use this as an early indicator for reactive attachment disorder before RAD had entered the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual. My teacher was named Florence Scott, née Florence Sharp, who developed a lot of this work in the 50s and 60s. And when I was working with her in the 80s, we started to watch what was happening with reactive attachment disorder. We saw all the traumatized children, when they would crawl, would have their thumbs tucked deeply inside those fists. If you look at someone who is experiencing a deep trauma, the body language could look like this, with the thumbs right in the fists. So now we have a lot more ways for analyzing and looking at reactive attachment disorder, but this is the hand often, not every time, but often, of the child with that kind of trauma. Overall, the children that I work with who have injuries to this level of the brain, how they present on some kind of a trauma scale, as they can be suicidal. I've worked with kids who tell their parents, "Kill me now. I know you want to. Kill me now. I just want to die." They're kids that hurt others without having any conscience about it. They fight. They seem to lack compassion, have no regard for the emotional or physical well-being of others. They're the bullies. So again, that phrase, hurt people. It's very much true of these children. Now I'm going to distinguish. Yes, okay.
Question though, first, Betty. Rob was wondering over in the chat box, would this be the area where it kind of predicts later drug use or anything? Would that be at this level of the brain, or can you talk to that or come back to it at the end?
I can talk to that. And you know who's the world's leading expert on this is Dr. Gabor Mate. I work with him. We were just consulting today. Dr. Mate speaks deeply about early absence of a comforting parent, and the endorphins and the oxytocin and all the great yummy hormones that come from the comfort of having a loving parent, and how that is substituted with drugs. And he has worked on East Hastings Street in Vancouver with the street addicts there. He has a movie coming out. I can't recommend it to you highly enough. Please Google The Wisdom of Trauma. The only thing that is out there right now is the trailer. The movie's coming out soon, but even the trailer, I think, has more wisdom in it than some whole books that I have read. He's that good. Yes, the answer to that is yes. When we get the hormones of love and comfort flowing again, we can intervene before drug addiction becomes an issue. I do want to say one thing that is an observation about traumatized children is that children who have been sexually abused, physically abused, adults have been physically abused, often will experience a rush of oxytocin as a trauma. Now, that doesn't make sense because oxytocin is the love and cuddle hormone, but I've worked with children who will fight relaxing, because when they relax and someone holds them, they feel good, and that feeling good was sometimes a precursor to abuse and injury. So I work with children who will fight being close, making eye contact, and I never require children to make eye contact because sometimes it can be that painful that it reminds them of abuse. So now I want to say that I work with trauma and anxiety at two different levels. The trauma and anxiety that seems to come from the level of the brain we just discussed looks like life and death, existential anxiety. I will not survive this kind of feeling. You have to take care of this or I will die. This situation has to change or I will die. That's pretty high level anxiety. As we get up to the next level of the brain, what we're looking at is environmental anxieties. And those are the anxieties of like, the music is too loud. There's too much bright light. Stop talking to me. I can't process all of this. It's an environmental anxiety, sort of the too muchness of the world. Sometimes I work with children who have mostly this existential lower brain anxiety, and sometimes I work with children who have just a little different kind of anxiety that seems lodged higher in the brain, where just life is irritating. Get out of my face. Go away. Don't touch me. And so what we said about all of that sensory processing and in the entrainment with the parents applies at both levels of the brain. And children who have entrained with their parents who have nonverbal, really healthy nonverbal responses to the environment are themselves actually pretty flexible. Now, if we look at this next level of the brain, where this more environmental kind of anxiety starts to show up, these are the children, if you look at where it says 3 to 14 months of that midbrain or midcerebrum issue, appreciation of fine detail, one of the things that's happened is the two eyes are now working together. Two eyes look at the same thing at the same time. If that function has been injured, impaired, immature, what can happen is that our children will see double. They'll see wrong. Adults, again, have been a great resource for me. I worked with one woman who had eyes that wouldn't work together because of a brain injury. And she said she couldn't go to downtown Seattle because every time, if she wasn't looking directly at one of the tall skyscrapers, it would look like they were falling. It would look like there was movement all around her. So her sense of downtown was buildings constantly about to topple on her. She couldn't cross a street without a street light because she said she could not judge how far she had to run to get across the street, and simultaneously couldn't judge how fast the cars were coming, and at the same time couldn't judge how deep the curb was. So if she was not really strong in herself, she would sort of thunk as she stepped off the curb and dash madly across a street that she couldn't judge the width of, while a car was approaching and she didn't know how fast. So she was just overcome with anxiety every time she would leave her house, and in fact became agoraphobic as a result of it. So moving through the world is, you have to have a sense of where that world is, and you use your two eyes and your two-dimensional vision to do that. And in addition, if there's just a kind of too muchness to it all, there are too many people moving and too many people close to me and the lights are too bright, we become much more anxious just visually being in the world. When we look at the auditory skills, we're going to move over a little box there, go to those auditory skills. This is the part of our brain that when it is mature, it can filter out excess noise, extraneous noise, non-essential noise, and focus on what's happening so that we can pay attention to each other during this hour and deal with the end of the dishwasher cycle, which is maybe in the back of your brain in the other room later, right? It's not important. But if you're not able to discriminate, sounds become incredibly annoying to the point of frustrating, to the point of just plain anxiety. There's just a general overwhelmed sense. But another thing that I see a lot in the children that I work with is that they misinterpret tone of voice. This is your social brain. And we interpret tone of voice with this brain. And many of the children, mothers will say this, it feels like, I don't know if it is, 50% of the mothers say, I was talking to him in my normal voice. It was completely normal, neutral. And he's saying, why are you yelling at me? Because they hear and feel anger in your voice because they can't hear the tonality. So they live in a world when your brain does that to you, when your hurt brain does that to you, you may live in a world where it sounds like everyone's angry at you. And for those of you who may not be parents of this kind of child or are not even concerned for a child, there is a little phrase out there called resting bitch face. And that's the mom that approaches her child with a neutral face, like, Andrew, could you pick up your socks? And Andrew thinks she is furious with him. Andrew is upset. Andrew goes into a rage because Andrew has just experienced something that she wasn't expressing. So trauma, trauma. Tactily too, this is where we learn to tolerate, to deal, to cope with all of the textures and feel of the world around us. We feel our clothes on our body, but only when we put them on. But this whole world of textures, if every moment of the day you have a texture touching your body, perhaps one that you don't like jeans material. Oh my goodness, the number of people I work with who can't wear jeans. If those textures are repellent to you, you are living with a lot of stress. I worked with one young man at the Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington, where I was teaching a class, and he told me that he could not possibly continue in the class. He had to get out of the room. And the reason he had to leave the room, he said, was because there was a stack of broken down cardboard boxes in the corner of the room. And his big tactile sensory issue was cardboard. The very thought of cardboard touching itself would irritate him to the point that he started getting nauseous and need to throw up. If you live in a world where where just the textures of your world are challenging, you're living in a very much more difficult world than a neurotypical brain is living in. Under that category, oh, wait a minute, let me tell you too, touch. Oh my goodness. If you are tactily sensitive and anyone brushing by you touches you, these are the kids that reach out and punch the kid next to them in line who just brushed past them, because they experience the anxiety of it and then they create that little trauma for the other child. Just punch them. Those are the kids I work with. The corpus callosum is a part of what we look at this level of the brain. And there's so many functions related to it that are learning issues and behavior issues. But I want to talk about trust issues, because this is where some of our children can really fall apart. And I want to give the credit for this brilliant example to my colleague Nina Jonio, who has been looking at this issue. She's a practitioner in Gresham, Oregon. The corpus callosum helps send signals between the two sides of the brain. If it's inefficient, if it's not well connected, it too, if it's been traumatized, like by injury, it too can be a source of trauma. I want to look at it two ways. I want to look at how that corpus callosum might have gotten damaged by emotional trauma, and then I want to look at the emotional trauma it can cause. I do not know this man, but I know his story. He was in Germany. He was in a rehab, which is a housing facility for people with mental illnesses that cannot be resolved. He was cortically blind, and he had very poor memory. When he was a very, very young child, maybe a year and a half, he saw his mother, who was a prostitute, murdered in an alleyway. And at that point, his eyes shut down and his ability to transfer information between two of the hemispheres of the brain shut down. It's a place where I have seen children actually shut down when they can't cope with a memory that is so painful. And he had actually shut down the functioning. And this was tested by my teacher, Florence Scott. And it was only as we did the neurodevelopmental work and also had a psychotherapist working with him that he was able to resolve that issue. And not only did he get better in his interhemispheric communication, better two halves of the brain talking to each other better, he also started to get some vision back. It was remarkable. He was in his 40s. I think he was in his 40s. But then when you get that damaged corpus callosum, you have issues, memory issues that can build up this trust piece that Nina Jonio had spoken about. So I'm going to give you an example. You got a little kiddo and he comes home from school on Monday and there is no homework in there. And the teacher's saying, okay, we got to get the homework to you. When there was school, remember? So you tell him, Jeremy, if you bring homework home all 4 days, that's the rest of the 4 days this week, we're going to go out for frozen yogurt on Friday. Yay. And so on Tuesday, nothing comes home, and Wednesday, nothing comes home, and Thursday, there's something crinkled in the bottom of the backpack, and Friday, he pulls out his nice, clean sheet of homework and says, I want to go for frozen yogurt. Mom says, no, we said all the days this week. You did not. You did not say that. You are lying to me. You always lie to me. I hate you. Well, this poor little guy couldn't hold on to, the all the 4 days of the week he had to bring his homework home. So he remembers it and he brings it home one day, and it's Friday, which was the day for frozen yogurt. And a lot of trust issues go back and forth. Also, I work with children who have some of this issue, who will say, Mom says, well, did you put your clothes, did you put your laundry away? Yes, I did. She comes later, all the laundry's still in the laundry room. No, you didn't. It's sitting right here. Oh, duh, I forgot, because the memory issues that have to go back and forth between the corpus callosum, the two hemispheres of the brain across the corpus callosum, can become profound. So the child may not remember from 1 minute to the next, which causes the parent to believe the child is lying. So this was just a brilliant insight. And I have seen many children now. I said, do you feel like you can't trust what people are telling you? Do you feel like people are lying to you all the time? Well, yeah, I do. So now, for the movement people out there, hands and knees creeping along with different reflexes and patterns. It is an amazing tool to access this place in the brain. It brings it alive. The traumatized brain, however, may skip this stage because it's sort of boring, right, to be on your hands and knees, even if you're a baby and you just want to get up and run around, when you can use your cortical brain and be up there with the adults. But if you're a smart observer, you'll get that baby right back down on their hands and knees, because it can impact all of these sensory issues. It does help build these connections between the two sides of the brain. As you see the children creeping on hands and knees, you see greater regulation, you see greater ability to remember, you get better trustworthiness out of them. They calm down. And as this level of the brain matures, it's going to bring more order, more calm. It puts things into perspective for the child. It helps them order and regulate their world. And it's been used by adults for calming and meditation. And even there's one martial arts teacher in the Los Angeles area, I think, who says creeping on your hands and knees 10 minutes every morning and 10 minutes every afternoon, he swears, will relieve all back pain. So I'm going to skip to vocal tonality at this mid-cerebrum level. And again, we're talking about those abusive voices. Our children can often shout, yell, scream in abusive voices and then swear they did not do that. No, I did not yell. No, I did not yell at you. I was not mean. They can become a victim because they just, in their social group, because they can't match the tonalities of the social group. They can't make a joke. They don't know how to produce the tonality, produce a joke, have good conversations. The very last thing that I want to speak about, because I'm looking at the clock, is that when we take a look, I'm not going to go through the fine motor skills that are at the end of that bar there, but one of the things that we test as we are testing those fine motor skills is your HPA axis, which is the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. That HPA axis is the way that we manage stresses, multitasking, overwhelm. And for those of you that run a home, run a job, and manage a whole lot of other things in your life, a relative at the hospital, or, you know, the PTA. For those of you that are managing lots of those things and doing them fairly smoothly, good for you. You got a great HPA axis. Your hypothalamus and pituitary, which are the HP, sit in your brain, and the adrenals sit in your kidneys. And there's a loop there that helps us manage our stress. And when our HPA axis is not working well, which is true for many of the children with whom I work, these are the children that you say, please get on your coat, and suddenly you've got a puddle of tearful child on the floor, because that was too much to ask at that moment when they were thinking about whether or not they'd return their library book. And putting on your coat and your boots, oh my goodness, can cause overwhelm and distress. So you can see how this level of the central nervous system is the part that, if well regulated, manages our chaos, helps us be calm in the middle of the very busy world that we live in. It helps us to communicate between two hemispheres of the brain, keeps us calm, keeps us engaged in a way provides our coping mechanisms. And without these coping mechanisms, our anxiety can rise to very high levels, even if we don't have that lower level kind of existential trauma that is like, I am not going to survive this, you better come get me right now because I am dying. This is more like, the world is just too much and I gotta leave. And so we see this, we didn't even get a chance to bring up limbic rage. If you have a child who has major rages, please, do ask me about that. But I know that these are the levels of the brain that are often overlooked, and they are, it's sad that this becomes overlooked, because these are the parts of the brain that we cannot control through our conscious thinking, through behavior programs, through any mechanism that brings our consciousness to our behavior. Bringing consciousness to our behavior is also necessary, but my objective and my work is to meet it at the roots and to start healing it from the roots up. So I want to hand this is the way I see trauma and anxiety. I want to hand this over to Jessie for a minute. I have a hard time sometimes. I think I have to plug in my computer while Jessie's talking. I do want to do questions and answers, and so if anyone wants to stay, if you have to leave immediately, please let Jessie know. We'll answer your question first, and I'm going to plug in my computer, and Jessie has something to say.
I was just going to start sharing some of the questions that have been coming up. We had one from Kimberly. Would you recommend a child to have counseling or therapy before starting a neurodevelopment movement program?
I usually do it the other way around, or in conjunction with. The reason can be shame, and not that you have a shaming therapist, and therapists are wonderful people, and I don't want to live my life without my therapist, but also, if the child feels responsible, is given tasks that make them responsible for behavior over which they have no control, unbeknownst to us, you can develop shame. I really tried, Mom. I really, really tried. I really tried, but Sammy was just too mean, and I had to hit him. But often, if we have children with very deep levels of trauma, I won't even, and I've met some pretty horrific traumas on my journey. I don't even want to work with the child without also having a psychiatrist, a psychologist, or deeply trauma trained. That's the important part, the deeply trauma trained professional to help them process through the big black bag of ickiness that they can start accessing when they start feeling old feelings. And I have not even brought up the prenatal environment, and we do know what is stereotypical activity for a fetus that makes them healthy babies too. So another lecture, another time. Okay.
Another question from Amy. When we were talking about sensory work, would this type of work help with, and I'm probably not going to say it right, misophonia, so sensitivity to chewing, sniffling noises, other people?
Oh my goodness, yes. Yes, I have had several children who were unable to eat at the dining table when I met them because they could not tolerate the eating sounds of other people who now have very lovely family dinners. It's just one more of those sensory overwhelms. It's your thalamus, which we had discussed last time, that isn't sending the right signals to the brain and setting aside the signals that you don't need to pay attention to. And if all of us can hear other people chewing, but our brain says that's not important. Brains do a good job of filtering that out, unless you have a neurological impairment.
Could this kind of movement be applicable to a person with, say, like an intellectual disability and severe trauma that happened during their childhood, but is now an adult?
Okay, several pieces to that. One is not just movement. I want to really make that clear. Although I do work with a lot of movement people, and my background is in movement therapies, but it is reflex, it is motor patterns, it's mobility activities like walking, running, skipping, hopping, creeping, crawling. It is sensory processing in the context of good parenting. And I always give a nod to the great work being done in the biochemistry of what our DNA tells us about our genetics, genetic mutations, allergies, methylation issues, things that you might not even have heard of, right now in this setting. But so yes, so that said, it's not just movement. And adults are harder to work with than children, partly because they just have set habits. But I have definitely worked with adults with learning disabilities. Frequently, learning disabilities are not a cognitive or cortical brain problem. There are many issues that can be simply the result of not having functionality at lower levels of the brain. So if you've always seen double, this is just one example out of hundreds I could give, and that's the only one I'm going to give. If you've always seen double, you don't know that you see double, for one thing, because that's the way the world has always looked to you. So you suppress one eye, or words might move on the page, or you might pull a letter out of a random word from the line above or below, and you don't know that you're doing it. It's the way that you read. But the way that you read at 32 could be slow, with mispronunciations, reading the word through and saying though, horse becomes house, picking up a word from lower down and then pulling it back up again to the sentence above it. My apologies, I thought I had silenced that. We're going to ignore that. And so I have worked with people who have intellectual disabilities that turned out to be vision, corpus callosum issues, being able to read words but not make sense of the context. Many issues can be lower brain issues. And we do work with the cortical brain as well. We're just sort of focusing on this part today.
Another question from Amy. She asks, if someone has been a victim of repeated assault and developed somatic problems, could this program or this type of program help? Some examples: fibromyalgia, Raynaud's disease, and sometimes like leg or bladder problems where they give out. So I guess the first question
I want to say one thing. I don't do anything medical, okay? And my teacher was a nurse, and she was working with autoimmune disorders and stress-related disorders, and she had some great successes. And I would never promise or suggest that this would be a cure. Also, I think that somebody who's had multiple abuse situations, we would need to be working with the whole team. That doesn't mean you need to walk in with your team to do this, but I mean, I would not want to work with that amount. And I do not do medical work. I do not do medical work. That doesn't mean those things can't change. I've seen them change. So could you do a little announcement about, because I know some people are going to want to go.
Yes. If you are interested in one of the 5 free screenings and you'd like your name entered into the drawing, please put your name in the webinar chat with screening or free screening, and we will add you to that list and contact you within the next week. Also, just as a reminder, next Tuesday at the same time, we will be having our 3rd of the 3 webinars talking about education and learning.
And I want to add to that the reason that we did our trauma and anxiety workshop prior to the educational concerns is that often the trauma and anxiety are the very barriers to academic wholeness. In addition to very specific things in the non-anxious child, so many of our children now are coming to school with so much anxiety that decided to do the anxiety workshop prior to the learning skills workshop. So thank you so much. If you have more questions, feel free to contact me. You can Jesse's going to forward everything and anything to me. I so love seeing you here. This is so fun. And my hope is that you've gotten excited about what I get so excited. I stammer. No, I get so excited when we meet these deep and profound and seemingly intractable issues and understand that there are other ways to approach them. And there are ways that make sense, and there are ways deep in the brain without shame, without blame, but with a lot of work. You can address them. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And this will be sent as a replay in the next 24 to 72 hours. So watch your information for the link so that you can watch the replay.
And share it with others. Please share it broadly. We're trying to get more kids healthier and more adults healthier. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.